want to start by talking about what I think is a very prevalent view of social ontology and social kinds in particular. And this view suggests that social kinds need to be explicitly conceived of as such. So I think many philosophers think that social kinds in general need to be explicitly conceived of, represented, and believed to be as such. So Searle, in his 1995 book, says, what it is for some social kind X to be X is simply to be regarded as, used as, and believed to be X. And his example, the example that he gives is what it is for something to be a $10 bill is just for it to be regarded as such, to be used as such, and to be believed to be such. And Searle thinks that sometimes this holds for the type or kind as a whole, and sometimes it holds both for the type and for each individual token of the type. So for example, when it comes to money, Searle thinks that the type as a whole needs to be regarded as such, though he also acknowledges that there may be an individual token of money that is not regarded as such and yet would still qualify as money. So he has this fanciful example of a $10 bill that's being printed at the mint, and it somehow gets lost, falls through the floorboards. Nobody ever sees it, and yet it's still, he thinks, a token of a $10 bill, even though it's never actually believed to be a token of money. Now, he may or may not be right about this example, but he also thinks that there are other examples of social kinds where it seems as though both the type and the token need to be regarded as such. So not only do you need to have a conception of what it is to be that kind, but also every single instance of the kind needs to be regarded as an instance of the kind for it to be an instance. And this is not his example. It's my example. I think this example perhaps works well as an instance of this type of social kind where both the token and the type need to be regarded as such, and that's the example of permanent resonance. So to have a category, to have a kind of permanent resonance in a particular society or jurisdiction, there has to be a concept of permanent resonance, and we have to represent that category in some way, but also each individual permanent resonant needs to be explicitly regarded as such in order to be a permanent resonance. So this view we can think of as what I'm calling a logocentric view of social kinds or social ontology, because on this view, having attitudes towards a social kind generally entails representing it, and that usually means lexicalizing it, representing it in language. And Searle confirms this impression in a couple of instances in his 2010 book. These are two among, I think, many instances where he suggests something like this picture. He says, quote, all of institutional reality is created by linguistic representation. He also says, I attempt to explain the exact role of language in the creation, constitution, and maintenance of social reality. So this can also be viewed as the speech act view of social ontology. And it's, I think, captured well in Searle's formula for how social kinds are created and how instances of social kinds become instances of those kinds. So he says the formula that usually captures all such examples of creation of an instance of a social kind can be summarized as X counts as Y in context C. So for example, this river, X, counts as a political boundary, Y, in the context of some bilateral treaty, C. Or more generally, geographical features or physical landmarks count as political boundaries in the context of official treaties, agreements, and so on. And so the paradigmatic case is a speech act whereby an official, a magistrate, someone who's qualified to do so, points to some physical feature, or perhaps two officials from two different jurisdictions or states or nations, and they're hereby declare that this geographical feature or physical landmark counts as a political boundary. That seems to be the sort of paradigm case, and I think Searle thinks it covers many other instances of particular physical objects becoming members of social kinds. And I think that this view is not just Searle's view. I think this view is quite prevalent, and something like a logocentric picture, I think, is at least assumed in the background in many discussions of social ontology, even among philosophers who disagree with Searle on many points. Now, as other philosophers have pointed out, this account doesn't seem to describe many and perhaps even most social kinds. And maybe the first to point this out in print was Amy Thomason in a paper from 2003, where she observes that Searle does not recognize that many social kinds do not depend for their existence on having thoughts about those kinds themselves. So you need not conceive of them as such, you need not regard them as such, you don't have to believe them as such, and therefore you don't have to represent them in language. So she allows that this may hold true of the kind money, but she says it doesn't hold true of the kind of the social kind economic recession. So Thomason states a given economic state can be a recession even if no one thinks it is, and even if no one regards anything as a recession or any conditions as sufficient for counting as a recession. And I think recession is not an exception to the rule. She gives some other examples like racism. One could also mention a whole host of other kinds from the social sciences, sociology, economics, political science, and so on. So consider inflation, poverty, suburbia, migration, nomadism, kinship, economic growth, political corruption, refugee, proletariat, globalization, capital, and propaganda. Now, I'm rattling off these kinds just to try and support the idea that this may constitute the bulk of social reality, these kinds that need not be explicitly recognized or represented as such for them to come into existence. And therefore, their tokens also need not be regarded as tokens of those kinds to be tokens of those kinds. So that leads to, in previous work, I've tried to argue that this leads to a tripartite distinction between three kinds of social kinds. So the first are the ones that I've just been talking about that need not be represented as such to be to exist, to come into existence. They can exist without being recognized as such or without anyone having any attitudes towards them, such as inflation, racism, recession. But then there are others where the social kind must be represented as such, but arguably its instances need not be represented as such to be instances of that kind. So I mentioned Searle's example of money or $10 bill. Those arguably, the kind itself needs to be represented to come into existence in the first place, but individual tokens need not be recognized as such. Another maybe more controversial case is war. I won't try to make that case here, and I think it's a debatable case. But then there's the third category of social kinds are such that they must be represented as such to exist, and also whose instances must be represented as instances of the kind to be instances of the kind. So I mentioned the example of permanent resident. Another good example is Bitcoin. So with cryptocurrencies, they need to be represented in a public ledger, and I can't hold Bitcoin without everyone who is part of the cryptocurrency community, or at least some members of the cryptocurrency community, recognizing that I hold Bitcoin. Otherwise, I can't really hold Bitcoin. So unlike the case of the $10 bill, cryptocurrencies seem to be such that every token of the kind needs to be represented as a token of the kind for it to be an instance of that kind. So this tripartite distinction allows us to focus a little bit on this last category, which are the ones, I think, that have been the focus of a great deal of discussion in social ontology. And maybe they've had there's been too much of an emphasis on these kinds of social kinds. And these are, I think, often legal, institutional, or conventional in character, like permanent resident, which requires conditions that are set out by officials that involve representations of the kind. That's how the kind supposedly comes into existence. And then officials must represent each individual member as being an instance of the kind, i.e. is satisfying the conditions in that particular jurisdiction for them to be instances of that kind. So I think the same applies to other social kinds like Bitcoin, as I said, but also prime minister, many other legal, institutional, or conventional kinds. So in these cases, some members of society need to have a representation of the kind itself for the kind to exist, and they must represent each instance of the kind as an instance of that kind. Now, I think these are necessary conditions, and I think many people regard them as more or less sufficient. But I want to try to argue in this paper that they are far from sufficient, and that a lot more needs to happen for those categories to be genuine social kinds. But for the moment, just notice that since they must have a representation or concept of the kind and apply it to each instance, since members of society must conceive of the kind, these kinds are typically lexicalized. We usually have words for them. We typically represent them in language. Hence, I think the exaggerated focus on the importance of language to social ontology. But I'm going to try and argue that that role of language has been somewhat exaggerated. So we can also represent this in the form of a Venn diagram. If you think of social kinds in general as constituting the larger set, including such kinds as inflation and recession and racism and so on, then within that set, you have a subset, which are the concept-dependent social kinds. And money or $10 bill is perhaps an example of that. And then within that is a smaller subset, which is the token concept-dependent social kinds, which would include things like Bitcoin or permanent resident. So that picture kind of summarizes the tripartite distinction that I've been trying to explain. Now, one way of sort of pushing back against this picture a little bit, or pushing back against the centrality of language to the third kind of social kind, the ones that are very conventional and typically lexicalized, is to point out that after a kind is lexicalized and people are categorized accordingly, they also need to become embedded in a causal network to become genuine members of the kind. So it seems to me that this requires uptake from other members of society, as well as certain capacities in the individuals categorized. So one way of pushing back against the idea that it is sufficient to represent those kinds for those kinds to come into existence is to observe, for example, that it's not enough to have permanent resident status. So if I become a permanent resident in a certain jurisdiction, I am declared such by the relevant officials, but certain kinds of resources need to be available to the individual, and that status needs to be recognized by other members of society. Otherwise, it seems as though the designation of someone as being a member of the kind permanent resident is somewhat hollow. So what I want to try and suggest that even when it comes to type 3 social kinds, individuals don't become members merely by being categorized. And I think I'm going to try and criticize something I argued for in earlier work, because in earlier work I suggested that because these kinds are conventional and because they come into being merely by being represented, and merely and instances become members of those kinds merely by being designated as such, I tried to argue there that perhaps they weren't genuine social kinds, because they seem to be much more, they seem to be, in a phrase, invented rather than discovered, and therefore can be sort of multiplied at will. And so I argued that they weren't real social kinds, but I think that the mistake that I was making is to think of these kinds and their instances as being created by lexical fiat. So if you think that they come into being merely by being represented and conceived and lexicalized, then it seems that you're going to be driven to the conclusion that they don't correspond to genuine social kinds. But I think the right way to think about it is to say that these kinds don't come into existence merely by being represented, although that's a necessary condition. Other conditions also need to be in place for these kinds and their instances, for these kinds to come into existence and for their instances to become members of those kinds. So consider cases of recategorization. So these are cases in which someone is categorized as a member of a certain social kind, but then they get recategorized as a member of a different kind. Now, in those instances, I think it becomes clearer that you don't become a member of that kind merely by being categorized. A lot of other things need to take place. So here's, I think, a nice illustration of this from the recent events involving corporations and legislation. So there's been a controversy in many jurisdictions in many different states in the world about whether rideshare workers and other workers in the gig economy should be classified as contractors or independent contractors or as employees. And typically corporations want to classify them as contractors, whereas the workers themselves often would rather have the status of employees, because that would afford them many more rights. They would get certain kinds of benefits that they wouldn't as contractors. And in California in particular, the state legislature was convinced that this was the right way to think of these workers and to treat them, and that those are the rights and benefits that they should have, the ones pertaining to employees as opposed to contractors. So as a result, a bill was passed in both chambers of the California legislature in the United States, which became effective on January 1st, 2020, which ruled that workers must be classified as employees, not as contractors, if a company exerts control over how they perform their tasks, as well as satisfying other conditions. And under those conditions, the vast majority of workers for these corporations, the rideshare corporations, classified as employees as opposed to contractors. Now you would think, well, the legislature has ruled by fiat, these workers automatically become employees. Well, the gig economy corporations just refused to implement the law, to the point that several months later, the Attorney General, the highest judicial official in California, sued the rideshare corporations Uber and Lyft to begin to treat their workers as employees. Now, meanwhile, the corporations were lobbying with the electorate at large, with the public, for a proposition that would pass by referendum that would rewrite the state's labor laws to formalize the gig workers' status as independent contractors with highly restricted benefits. And this was pitched to the public as an improvement, that this would actually be to the benefit of the workers, that they should be treated as contractors as opposed to employees. It would give them greater flexibility and so on, for reasons I think that really were spurious. But what happened is that they succeeded. They mounted a huge advertising campaign and spent tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And in November of 2020, the law was overturned, and they rewrote the labor laws. And so they were never employees at all. They remained contractors. Now, I think this episode illustrates some of the ways in which categorization or recategorization by legislative fiat needs to have the right kind of uptake for individuals to become members of social kinds. It's not sufficient merely to, as it were, enact the law by speech act. A lot of other things have to take place on the ground, so to speak, for those individuals to become members of a different social kind. And I think this also applies to not just to instances of kinds becoming instances of those kinds, but certain kinds themselves coming into existence. So think about certain social kinds, particularly legal kinds, that exist on paper, but don't really are never enforced and don't really have any teeth, as it were. So in many states in the United States, sex outside marriage was or is in some jurisdictions considered illegal. And in most of those, in the vast majority of jurisdictions, these laws are never enforced. So in these jurisdictions, there's a legal category fornication, but I would argue that there isn't a corresponding social kind, because nobody ever, no magistrate, no law enforcement official ever treats people who have sex outside marriage as fornicators, prosecutes them, arrests them, and so on. So, and in some jurisdictions, these laws were never enforced. So even though they exist on the books, nobody is ever actually prosecuted under those laws. So it seems to me this again emphasizes the idea that creating a legal category doesn't automatically create a social kind. Social uptake is necessary. It might be, in some cases, a necessary condition to represent those kinds, but it's certainly not a sufficient condition, because a social uptake is necessary both for a token to be a member of a social kind and for the kind itself to exist. So what is uptake? What do I mean by social uptake? Well, I think it's a very broad category, and I think it can take many forms in the social domain. In some of the examples that we've looked at, it requires law enforcement by certain officials, prosecution, arrest, imprisonment, but also individual acts, protesting, boycotting, voting in the California gig economy case, collective action by groups, unionizing, strikes, also institutional influence, ad campaigns, lobbying, and so on. So the importance of language, it seems to me, the social domain has been greatly exaggerated. Even when it comes to these social kinds, type 2 and especially type 3 kinds, which have to be represented as such and are usually lexicalized, representation and lexicalization play a limited role, because they need to be supported by what I'm calling social uptake, which involves participation in causal processes in the social domain. And as I said in previous work, I think I was also in the grip of this very logocentric picture of these kinds, and I argued that they perhaps weren't social kinds. But I think that once those kinds are represented as such and conceived to be such, that needs to be translated into action for the categories to become genuine social kinds, or for individuals to become members of those kinds. So to conclude, it seems to me that some philosophers, including my earlier self, think that language is central to social ontology and have given language a sort of exaggerated role. And this logocentric view is misleading for a couple of reasons. One is that many, and perhaps even most, social kinds are not explicitly represented as such, and hence not lexicalized. And second, that kinds in their instances do not come into being or become members simply by being represented. There needs to be social uptake, which I would argue always involves participation in causal processes in the social domain. So that's my presentation. And I'm looking forward to questions, discussion, comments,